Imagine being a king, but having no army, no barracks. No soldiers waiting in formation. Not a single professional warrior on payroll, and yet, at any moment, you could be invaded. A rival noble could rebel. A neighboring kingdom could march on your lands. So, how did medieval kings defend themselves without standing armies? They did something even stranger. They sent letters, not to generals, but to farmers, to local landlords, to priests, abbots, blacksmiths, and innkeepers. And within weeks, an army appeared out of nowhere. But how? What did these kings promise or threaten? To turn peasants into soldiers and landowners into knights? How did an army operate when every man in it was counting down the days until he was legally allowed to go home? And why did this bizarre system eventually collapse, replaced not by loyalty or honor, but by cold, hard cash? This is the forgotten story of how wars were fought before standing armies existed. A story not of bravery, but of bureaucracy. A story not of glory, but of obligation, money, and quiet negotiation. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll look at medieval battlefields very differently. Chapter 1. Before the call to arms. When you imagine a medieval king marching to war, you might picture him at the head of a glittering army rows of armored knights on horseback, banners snapping in the wind, spearmen advancing in perfect ranks. You might assume that such an army was always ready, always waiting, that these soldiers were professionals who trained daily for the moment when their sovereign would beckon them forth. But if you were an English king in, say, the 11th or 12th century, nothing could be further from reality. You did not possess a ready-made army. You possessed obligations, promises, and paperwork. Your military strength was scattered across the countryside, burrowed in villages and manors, hidden behind plows and beneath wool cloaks. Your knights were not in barracks, they were tending to estates, arguing over inheritance disputes, collecting rents from peasants, or calculating how much ale would be needed to appease their households for the winter. Your infantry were not drilled in formations on parade grounds. They were farmers, smiths, millers, shepherds, and coopers. They had calloused hands, but not from handling swords, and yet, within weeks, sometimes mere days, you were expected to turn this dispersed mass of landowners and laborers into an army. How did you do it? You relied on a system older than paperwork and stronger than iron: obligation. Not loyalty in the modern sense, not patriotism in the national sense, but layers of contracts, some written, most spoken, all fueled by land. Land was power, and power came with strings. Every acre granted from king to noble, and from noble to knight, came with one expectation: when called, you will fight. This was the essence of feudal military service, the engine that powered medieval warfare long before standing armies existed. At its core was a simple exchange. I, the king, give you land. You, the vassal, owe me soldiers. But enforcing this promise was anything but simple. The entire system was a carefully balanced web of favors and fears, of incentives and subtle threats. Let us imagine a moment, not from the perspective of the king, but from you, the land-holding knight. You wake at dawn, not to a trumpet or a drill instructor, but to a rooster and the soft clatter of servants preparing porridge in the hall below. You are Sir Thomas of Wexcombe, or perhaps Lady Eleanor of Stowe, depending on circumstance. You hold 2 manors from your liege lord, the Earl of Gloucester. Your lands provide income, grain harvests, a modest flock of sheep, a mill that grinds flour for the local villagers. You have a household of perhaps 6 to 10 retainers men who owe you service in exchange for food and lodging. On this morning, you find a rider waiting in your courtyard, his horse flecked with mud from travel. He dismounts with stiff limbs and presents a sealed letter. The king requires service. Your lord commands it. You are to gather your arms, your retainers, and your mounted equipment, and report to Gloucester Castle within 40 days. You are expected to serve for no more than 40 days, That is the legal limit of your feudal obligation. Beyond that, if you remain, the king must pay you 40 days. That is the curious number that every knight knew by heart. Not 40 men, not 40 shillings, not 40 lashes. 40 days of war, unpaid. Anything longer, and it was no longer duty, it was employment. Now you must make decisions. Do you ride yourself? Do you send a substitute? Do you bring all 6 retainers, or only 3? How well armed are they? How much food must you carry? Do you take your best horse and risk its death in combat? Do you leave your estate exposed to bandits and rival lords while you are gone? Meanwhile, across the kingdom, the same moment is happening in hundreds of halls and villages. Some knights will respond eagerly, polishing armor with pride. Some will grumble. Some will try to avoid service entirely, pleading illness or sending an ill-prepared cousin in their stead. Some will comply, but resentfully. They will count each passing day of service like a prisoner marking time on a wall. And what of the infantry? They too are summoned not by letter, but by custom. The Fyrd, England's great levied host, was raised from among the free peasants and minor landholders. They were expected to fight with spear or axe, often at their own expense. Some came willingly. Others had to be threatened with fines. This method of raising armies was astonishingly decentralized. The king issued commands, but implementation rested entirely in the hands of the nobility. Lords were responsible for mustering their own men. Some did so with discipline, enforcing loyalty through charisma or force. Others were notoriously lax. Some inflated their numbers on paper to gain favor. Others undersupplied their men, hoping to cut costs. A modern general might track troop numbers on logistics charts. A medieval king had to track promises. He kept lists not of soldiers, but of who owed what. A baron with 10 knights under him. A bishop with men-at-arms retained through church lands. A wealthy abbey that owed packhorses or carts rather than actual fighters. Even monasteries, though seldom fighting directly, might be required to send wagons, oxen, and supplies. To examine a medieval army is to see less of a single entity and more of a patchwork quilt sewn together overnight. This patchwork nature created unusual situations. Imagine an army on the march. One contingent rides under blue banners of a northern earl. Another marches under red pennants of a southern baron. They speak different dialects. They obey different commanders. Their armor is not uniform. Their equipment varies wildly. Some soldiers wear full mail hauberks and carry fine Norman swords. Others wear padded jerkins and carry converted farming tools. Some linger in high spirits, singing or boasting. Others mutter about when their 40 days will be up. And yet, this messy force could win wars. Feudal armies were not built for long-term campaigns. They were designed for fast strikes, sieges, or defensive musters. If a rebellion erupted, the king could, in theory, call upon dozens of lords, who in turn summoned hundreds of knights, who in turn rallied thousands of peasants. But timing was always an enemy. Assemble too slowly, and the rebels gained ground. Assemble too quickly, and you risked arriving without enough provisions or cohesion. There was also the question of trust. Kings feared giving too much power to their vassals. A noble who could raise 300 men for the king could just as easily withhold those 300 or worse, lend them to a rival. In England, following the Norman conquest, the monarchy made efforts to fragment landholdings deliberately. A single earl might have estates scattered across multiple regions, making it difficult for him to consolidate local power. This was intentional. Divide and govern. Over time, kings experimented with alternatives to direct feudal summons. They issued scutage, a tax allowing knights to pay money instead of serving personally. This money could then be used to hire mercenaries, professional soldiers, unburdened by 40-day limits. But this created tension. Some nobles resented being asked for money rather than valor. Others preferred it. Some kings leaned heavily into scutage, effectively turning military service into revenue. Others distrusted paid fighters, preferring loyalty over coin. You can imagine the anxiety of those early monarchs, reliant on a military system they did not fully control. You can also imagine the anxiety of the summoned vassals, forced to ride to war with people they barely knew under commanders they did not choose. Every campaign was a negotiation long before it was a battle. And yet, what choice did they have? Without permanent armies, without barracks or conscription machinery, without centralized training facilities, without permanent payrolls, this was the only system available. It was slow. It was chaotic. It was based on promises and personalities. But it worked until it didn't. So when did it fail? At what moment did the old feudal summons begin to crack under pressure? What kind of enemy could expose its weaknesses so thoroughly that kings would abandon centuries of tradition in favor of hiring strangers? Chapter 2: Cracks in the system, when obligation wasn't enough. If the feudal summons was a patchwork of promises, then its greatest flaw was time: 40 days of forced service, after which every knight, every retainer, every reluctantly armed farmer could legally turn their horse around, ride home, and return to tending sheep or scolding tenants. That was the unbreakable contract of early medieval warfare. Obligation had an expiration date. Kings learned quickly that war did not respect calendars. A siege might drag into its 8th week. A march into foreign territory might be slowed by swollen rivers, broken supply wagons, or deliberate scorched earth resistance. And all the while, every man in your host could count the days. It is easy to imagine what this did to royal planning. If you were King Henry II of England in the mid-12th century, preparing to assert control over rebellious barons in Normandy, every campaign was a logistical riddle. Not just can I win, but can I win quickly? Some vassals honored the full length of their pledge. Others left early without permission. Technically, this could be considered treason. In practice, punishing nobles for leaving a campaign after their 40 days risked rebellion. A king could not imprison half his aristocracy. So he improvised. If obligation was too fragile, perhaps money would prove stronger: scutage, turning knights into currency. Scutage, from the Latin scutum, shield, was the first major attempt to reform the feudal summons. Rather than sending themselves or their men, knights could pay a fixed fee per knightly obligation. The rate varied, but it gave kings a tantalizing new tool. Instead of uncertain service bound by time limits, they could gather coins and hire soldiers who fought as long as they were paid. This was not a sudden invention. Kings had occasionally accepted money in lieu of personal service before. But under Henry II, scutage became a policy. It was controversial. Many knights welcomed scutage. Why ride across the channel to risk death in a muddy field when you could send coin instead? Others despised it. To them, being a knight was not merely a landholding arrangement, it was an identity. Paying instead of fighting was dishonorable. Some suspected that scutage was merely an excuse for the king to grow wealthier without oversight. Still, scutage worked. Henry II used it extensively to fund mercenaries, particularly Flemish and Brabançon infantrymen who had little interest in English politics, but great interest in steady pay. This marked a subtle but important shift. The king no longer depended entirely on vassal loyalty. He could now purchase obedience, but scutage created a new imbalance. Lords who fought resented those who paid their way out. Lesser knights who could not afford scutage found themselves on the battlefield while wealthier neighbors remained at home. The old feudal camaraderie, thin as it already was, began to fracture. The system still functioned for a while, until a king came to power who pressed it too far. King John, when reform becomes resentment John, younger brother of Richard the Lionheart, inherited the English throne in 1199. He is often remembered as one of England's worst monarchs. Unpopular, paranoid and perpetually at war with his own nobles. It was John who, through pressure and mismanagement, helped push England's aristocracy to rebellion, resulting in the sealing of the Magna Carta in 1215. One of the chief grievances in that document, scutage. John imposed scutage heavily and frequently, far beyond what his predecessors had done. He used it not for brief continental campaigns, but to fund long, drawn-out wars in France, wars his barons had little interest in supporting. Worse, he sometimes demanded both personal service and scutage, depending on convenience. This was seen as an abuse of trust. Scutage was supposed to be an alternative, not an additional tax. Many lords refused to pay. Others paid resentfully. In some cases, entire baronies resisted enforcement. John retaliated by seizing estates or taking hostages. The situation escalated until scutage, intended as a solution, had become evidence of tyranny, and beneath it all, the original military problem remained, even with scutage, even with mercenaries. The king could not maintain consistent military power without cooperation. The question grew louder in royal courts. Was feudalism still worth the trouble? Royal household knights, loyalty through proximity. If great nobles were unreliable, then perhaps lesser men could be made more dependable, provided they were tied not to land. But to favor, kings began to maintain small retinues of personal knights, household knights, also known as milites regius. These were not distant vassals summoned only in time of emergency. They were attached directly to the royal household, living at court or receiving regular stipends in exchange for permanent service. Household knights were the medieval precursor to a standing army, not vast, not uniform, but constant. A king who could summon 50 personal knights at will had more control than when dependent entirely on the goodwill of magnates. Over time, household knights became a political class of their own men, whose careers depended solely on royal patronage rather than hereditary wealth. They were often younger sons of nobility, landless but ambitious. They saw service not as duty, but as opportunity. Still, they were expensive, and kings could rarely maintain more than a few dozen at any time. Useful for skirmishes, escort duty, or sudden arrests of rebellious barons, but not sufficient for major campaigns. Household knights solved one problem, reliability, but not another, scale. Contracts and retainers. War becomes negotiation. By the 13th and 14th centuries, England's military system shifted again. Instead of summoning lords and trusting them to bring uncertain numbers of men, kings began issuing indentures, formal contracts that spelled out exactly how many troops a lord would bring, for how long, and at what rate of pay. This marked the birth of contract warfare. No longer was military service strictly tied to landholding. A noble might still fight because he must, but increasingly, he fought because he was paid. These contracts extended beyond the nobility. Wealthy knights, even some professional captains, would gather small companies of spearmen and archers and offer them collectively to the king. The army was no longer gathered by command, it was gathered by agreement. But there was a catch. If your army is based on contracts, what happens if someone offers better terms? This was the question that would haunt kings for centuries. A paid soldier could be loyal today and gone tomorrow. Worse, he might change sides entirely. Mercenary captains, in particular, were notorious for shifting allegiance to the highest bidder. Feudal levies might be slow, unruly, and time-limited, but they seldom betrayed you for coin. Hired men could be devastatingly efficient and devastatingly unstable, which brings us to the next evolution. If obligations were weak and contracts were risky, perhaps commerce could offer a solution. Perhaps war could be simply purchased. When war became a marketplace across the Channel, in the patchwork of Italian city-states, Florence, Milan, Venice, Siena, a different model was already emerging. They did not bother summoning citizens. They did not rely on landed vassals. Instead, They hired condottieri professional captains whose entire identity was warfare. These men commanded companies that could be bought, disbanded, rehired, or destroyed. War became transactional. Loyalty became contractual. Cities did not raise armies, they rented them. Could England follow this path? Could a king abandon the ancient summons altogether and rely only on coin? Not yet. England was a kingdom of deep feudal roots. Its nobles were not about to surrender their military importance. But every reform scutage, household knights, indentured contracts was a step in that direction. It was no longer a question of whether the feudal summons would one day be replaced. It was merely a question of when and by whom. Which king would be brave or desperate enough to finally abandon obligation in favor of institution? Which war would prove so costly, so complicated, so prolonged, that feudal duty would be declared obsolete? Would it be a war against rebellious barons? A war abroad in the fields of France? Or perhaps a war unlike any king had ever faced before, one fought not against soldiers, but against statistics? Chapter 3. From Obligation to Profession. The birth of the paid soldier. War, for all its brutality, is often shaped less by steel and strategy than by numbers of bodies, of coins, of days lost or gained. Kings learned, reluctantly and unevenly, that loyalty unpaid was loyalty unstable. The old world of feudal obligation, with its 40 days of service and awkward negotiations between land and duty, could manage rebellions and border skirmishes. But it was not built for long wars. And then, in the 14th century, England found itself trapped in one. The 100 Years' War, when 40 days became meaningless, in 1337. King Edward III of England pressed his claim to the French throne, igniting what would become the 100 Years' War, a conflict not of months, nor of years, but of generations. There was no way to fight such a war with part-time soldiers. You could not besiege a French stronghold for 38 days and then politely inform your army that their obligations had expired. You could not march deep into Gascony or Normandy with men who were already planning what excuse they might offer to return home. Edward III understood this. He did not abandon the feudal summons. It was too deeply rooted to discard. But he supplemented it aggressively with paid contracts, retainers, and specialist troops. Feudal levies still existed, but they were increasingly absorbed into a wider system based on pay rather than promise. Most importantly, Edward did something radical. He paid the archers. The rise of the longbowman, England's first mass-paid infantry. The longbow had existed for centuries, particularly in Wales, where skilled archers could put an arrow through mail armor at hunting distances. Earlier kings had used longbowmen, but never systematically. Edward III changed that. He recognized that the longbow was not merely a weapon, it was a military doctrine, and so he began hiring archers in bulk. Not as peasants reluctantly summoned, but as contracted professionals, often receiving twice the pay of spearmen. These were not noble knights with horses and coats of arms. They were yeomen and freeholders, middle class by medieval standards, independent enough to negotiate terms. They fought not for land but for wages. It is easy to think of armies as shaped by ideology or glory. But at Crécy, 1346, at Poitiers, 1356, and at Agincourt, 1415, English armies were shaped by regular payments, recorded in royal rolls as carefully as any census. The victories of those famous battles were not won by feudalism. They were won against it, the Black Death, when labor became more valuable than loyalty. If the 100 Years' War strained the feudal system, the Black Death shattered it. Between 1348 and 1350, plague swept through England, killing perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. Peasants became scarce. Laborers were suddenly valuable. For centuries, nobles had relied on the idea that peasants owed them service. But what happens when peasants can simply walk away and find a better offer elsewhere? Even kings faced competition. Why fight for free or for obligation-defined wages when a merchant or landlord would pay more for ditch digging or threshing grain? The cost of everything rose: grain, weapons, horse fodder, and men. To secure soldiers, kings had to pay higher wages. To keep them loyal, they had to offer bonuses, land grants, or pensions. The feudal summons, once a symbol of royal authority, now felt like a plea. The crown did not dissolve feudal service, but the economy did. Statutes and reforms, the legal death of obligation. Kings did not always acknowledge change willingly. They tried to regulate wages. They tried to limit the mobility of workers. They issued laws demanding that men serve when summoned, as if parchment could reverse the march of economics. But laws were powerless against mathematics. Over time, feudal service was increasingly commuted into cash payments automatically. Many landowners no longer even expected to fight. They expected to write a check, figuratively speaking, and let the king sort out the rest. Royal armies became hybrids, partially summoned, partially contracted, partially hired. By the late 14th century, fully professional captains led companies of retainers who served for fixed wages. By the early 15th century, mustering commissions recorded soldiers not by feudal obligation, but by pay scale. If you examined a military roll from 1100, you would find who owes service. If you examined one from 1400, you would find who is owed payment. The ledger had reversed. What replaced feudalism? Not a standing army, not yet. That would come centuries later, after civil wars, religious upheavals, and the slow growth of bureaucratic states. But by the 15th century, kings had learned a lesson that would echo across empires. An army built on obligation lasts for days. An army built on payment lasts for years. Obligation could summon men reluctantly. Payment could retain them. Obligation created armies of necessity. Payment created armies of profession. Even loyalty could be bought not in the cynical sense, but in the practical one. A knight who fought for pride might falter when bored or hungry. A mercenary who fought for wages might be unreliable in principle, but reliable in contract, so kings adapted. They began to think like managers, not monarchs. They tracked expenses. They reviewed supply chains. They balanced recruitment against taxation. They issued uniforms not for unity of spirit, but for unity of inventory. War was no longer a feudal right, it was administration. The last echoes of the summons. Though the feudal summons faded from practical use, it lingered in ceremony. Even into the 17th century, English monarchs occasionally issued formal calls to arms, but they were symbolic gestures. Political theater rather than military necessity. The true armies of later centuries, those of the Tudors, the Stuarts, and eventually the parliaments, were built on taxation, bureaucracy, and centralized finance. Peasants no longer marched because they were told to. They marched because they were paid to. Knights no longer rode because they owed land service. They rode because they were commissioned, with letters bearing seals, promising salaries and spoils. And yet, was this truly better? Reflection. Did professional armies make war better, or just easier? It is tempting to say that the fall of the feudal summons was a victory of order over chaos. No more half-trained farmers stumbling into battle for 40 days at a time. No more lords arriving late or leaving early. No more reluctant levies, but there is another way to view it. When war was bound by obligation, limited by tradition, it was constrained. It was bound by time limits, by seasonal harvests, by reluctant hearts. When war became contractual, when payment replaced duty, it gained endurance. Kings could now fight longer, harder, further from home. Does that make it better? Or simply more efficient? Is it safer to live in a world where soldiers fight for honor, or one where they fight for wages? Which is more dangerous? An army built on obligation that dissolves after 40 days, or an army that never goes home. And that's where we'll end tonight's quiet journey through forgotten history. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your time, and possibly your dreams, with me. I'm glad you're here, whether you're already asleep, almost there, or just peacefully listening. I hope this little corner of history helped you drift a bit further away from the noise of the day. If you'd like more calm stories like this, the kind that wander instead of rush, feel free to like the video, subscribe, and ring the softest notification bell you can find. This has been Quiet Boring Sleep, where even the past whispers softly. Good night, and I'll see you in the next slow story.